Of Islamic Civilization by Ali A. Alawi. Chapter 1, Tearing the Fabric. Abandoning the Islamic worldview, the mid 19th century saw the Muslim world convulsed by the dramatic changes which jolted its consciousness. What united the disparate parts of the civilization of Islam at this point were the issues of foreign encroachment and Muslim weaknesses. To the new breed of Muslim thinkers and scholars, there was simply no room for the notion of the individual balancing between the demands of inner ethic and outer code of action. These were insufficient to address Muslim powerlessness in the face of unremitting imperial expansion. It was action, not contemplation, that was needed. What mattered was to refashion the understanding of Islam in ways which could ensure that Muslims had the wherewithal to confront the claims of the West to political, economic, and military superiority. The sense of inadequacy in front of European civilization extended even to the moral sphere. Many exclaimed that it was now Europe that carried the virtues which Islam had claimed as its exclusive preserve. A process was started which radically undermined the possibility of reaching a form of modernity that stayed within the framework of Islam. Critically, the gateway to modernity and thus to re empowerment was seen as lying outside the civilization of Islam itself. In many ways, the need to justify the worldview of Islam echoes the debates between the Muslims of the early centuries of Islamic civilization and the Hellenized and Christian populations who lived under Muslim rule and who doubted Islam's superiority as a religion and as metaphysics. Great difference was that in the earlier period it was Islam that held temporal power and could determine the direction of its outcome. The situation was now reversed, with the confident and expansionist West relentlessly challenging the basic assumption of a civilization which was clearly in retreat, at least in its territorial dimension. Here, the case of successful modernization of Japan, which commenced in earnest only in 1868 after the Meiji Restoration, represents a serious counterexample and raises a dilemma concerning the apparent failure of modernization in the 19th century Muslim world. In fact, Egypt, which had become an autonomous political entity in 1821 under the rule of the Albanian Muhammad Ali, had embarked on an effort to modernize its state and society a full 50 years before Japan started its own process. At the end of the century, Japan was well on the way to joining the advanced powers while Egypt languished under British rule. In Japan, the emphasis was on strengthening the bonds of Japanese exclusiveness through education, through state Shintoism, and through the traditional virtues of thrift, diligence, and loyalty in order to construct a modern economy. These were the legacies of Japan's Tokugawa past, and they were not discarded or questioned in the Meiji's reformers' plan. It was true that Japan's modernizing ethic involved an acceptance of certain Western ways, especially in state administration and economic and technological management. But this acceptance was always discriminating, even eclectic. The alliance between a reforming bureaucracy and a nascent industrial and financial class did ultimately end in militarism, plutocracy, and a catastrophic war. And the country had to be fundamentally recast in the post war era. But this was by no means preordained. In Egypt, the possibility of Islam providing a door to modernity was not only questioned, it was often rejected on principle. Worse, there was an attempt to shoehorn Islam into the constructs of modern science and rationality, the implicit assumption being that Islamic civilization was incapable of providing the foundations for its own scientific explorations and advance. The illustrious Indian pedagogue and scholar Sir Syed Ahmad Khan had said as much. In an 1884 lecture on Islam, Sir Syed spoke of the need for a new rationality, a new theology which reinterpreted the sacred text of the Quran in the light of reason and science. This was the precursor to countless calls to reread the texts of Islam in an elusive manner from the angle of personal or social utility, democratic rights, socialism, feminism, or whatever the pressing issues of the time might have been. In 1883, the noted French philologist Ernest Renan delivered a lecture entitled Islam and Science, in which he asserted inter alia that the Arabs were hostile to science and philosophy, and that whatever science had entered Islamic civilization came from non-Arab sources. A retort followed from the pan-Islamic agitator and ideologue, the Iranian-born Sayyid Jamaluddin al-Afghani. He broadly agreed with Renan, but went several steps further towards a general denunciation of religious faith and of its incompatibility with the scientific spirit. Afghani wrote in his response to Renan, "A true believer must, in fact, turn from the path of studies that have as their object scientific proof. What would be the benefit of seeking scientific proof when he believes he possesses it all?" Later in an article, Afghani wrote, specifically as regards the Muslim religion, declared that wherever it became established, this religion tried to strive the sciences. It is astounding that one of the greatest exponents of pan-Islamic revival, who had an unrivaled influence on his contemporaries, could hold his own civilization in such scorn. Afghani's thought influenced a great number of people, and his speculations on Islam and science became received wisdom for the next century and set the pattern of subsequent views regarding the essential incompatibility between Islam and science. The undermining of confidence in the ability of Islamic civilization to adapt to modernity extended over all aspects of life, propelled by the torrent of new thought flowing in from the West. The uncritical adoption of Western ideas by leading reformers of the Muslim world, who had lost their connection with the universe of the spiritually balanced individual and community, contributed greatly to the collective loss of self-understanding which was felt in the entire Muslim world in the 19th century. One after another, the pillars of Islam's unique constructs were demolished, frequently without the proponents of an alternative being fully aware of the consequences of their acts. One example is the financial and economical consequences arising from the juridical opinions given by Muhammad Abdah, Afghani's foremost disciple and co-worker, until he broke with him. Abdah was an advocate of ijtihad, that is, the use of independent reasoning to reach juridical conclusions, and he extended its scope to cover areas that were not previously considered within its legitimate ambit. In this process, he authorized, for instance, the establishment of interest-based banking in a 1903 fatwa. This legitimized the establishment of financial institutions of a Western type, which set the pattern of economic development in Egypt and elsewhere in the Muslim world. This simple move effectively put a stop to the possibility of developing any meaningful financial and exchange institutions which might have drawn on the traditional Islamic economic and financial transactions, avoiding the religiously problematic issue of interest altogether. Revivalists and the Golden Age of Islam. Revivalist movements in Islam predated the arrival of the Europeans. The 18th century saw the rise of a number of significant movements for reform and revival that sought to purify the Islamic life and society. These coincided with the ebb of power that affected all three main Muslim empires of the time. The leaders of these movements were mainly drawn from the ranks of the ulama, religious scholars, and from the the Sufis. The ulamas were appalled by the loosening of religious standards and toleration of dubious, even pagan practices that increasingly inflected popular Islam. This was especially evident in the multi ethnic Mughal Empire of India, with its large Hindu majority population, where an accommodating and syncretistic Islam was tolerated and even promoted by the court. The last of the powerful Mughal rulers, Aurangzeb, abandoned the policy of religious accommodation and sought to impose a strong Islamic identity on the empire. The Mughal state was greatly weakened by the death of Aurangzeb in 1707 and could no longer foster a powerful Islamic identity. The task of protecting the cause of Islam fell to the ulamas. One of the first to rise to the task was Shah Waliullah Dehlvi, 1703 to 62. Born in Uttar Pradesh in India, Shah Waliullah spent 12 years in Makkah and Medina advancing his religious knowledge and credentials. He was an advocate of a close reliance on Hadith, the saying of the Prophet Muhammad, as a guide to correct Islamic action and conduct. The emphasis on the authority of the Hadith is a common feature in Islamic reformers and revivalists even into the present period. Shah Waliullah left over 50 major works in Arabic and Persian, including two, The Shining Lights and The Flashing Lights, which are masterpieces of mystical philosophy. He was a tireless proselytizer for Islam and a champion of Islamic unity in India, and he sought an accommodation between the Shia and Sunnis. His son Shah Abdul Aziz was himself noted scholar in the revivalist tradition. By the time India was slipping nearly entirely out of Muslim control, which promoted Shah Abdul Aziz famously to declare India to be Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, India could no longer be considered a domain under Islamic law. Shah Abdul Aziz's 1803 fatwa was directed mainly against the British and called for jihad against their presence. In West Africa, the revivalist movements originated mainly from the Fulani people with their deep Islamic attachments. They spread into the Sahara, brought them in contact with pagan and semi-Islamicized tribes, which promoted one of the most famous jihads of the 18th and the early 19th centuries, that of Usman dan Fodio, 1754 to 1817. Usman never traveled to Mecca or Cairo for his religious education, drawing instead on the Sufi networks of the Sahara to which he belonged. Usman's preaching in Hausaland, modern-day Nigeria, generated tensions with the local rulers, which led to his call for jihad in 1804. The wars were successful and Usman founded the Sultanate of Sokoto, which persisted until the British conquest of Nigeria at the end of 19th century. The revivalist movements of the 18th and 19th centuries were also related to the direct rise of the Naqshbandiya Sufi movement, an order that sought to purify Sufism from the practices that were unacceptable to the orthodox ulama. A number of leaders of the reform movements of the 18th and 19th century were themselves affiliated with the Naqshbandiya order, including Shah Waliullah himself. The anti-Dutch rebellions in northern Sumatra throughout the 19th century were also actively supported by the Naqshbandiya. A similar story unfolds in the Caucasus. Both major rebellions against the Russians by Imam Mansur in 1785 to 91 and later by Imam Shamil were led by the Naqshbandiya Sheikhs. In eastern Turkestan, Naqshbandiya Sheikhs led uprising against Manchu rule throughout the 19th century. Other Sufi orders of the period also sought to purify their doctrines and practices and bring them closer to orthodoxy. These orders would play a major role both in the revivalist movement and in the resistance of foreigners. The Sanusiya order, founded by Muhammad al-Sunusi, 1787 to 1859, is a case point. Al-Sunusi founded numerous lodges, zawiyas, in the Libyan desert, which acted both as a scaffolding for the nascent state and as the focus of resistance to French and later Italian advances into Sahara. Part of the message and allure of the revivalists consisted in their attempts to construct a golden age of Islam, an age from which Muslims deviated, thereby condemning themselves to a secondary status. The many revivalist movements of the pre-modern period were ultimately eclipsed in their significance by uncompromising and literalist monotheism associated with the Hanbali scholar Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab, 1703 to 1902, the founder of the eponymous Wahhabi movement. Abdul Wahhab had based his teachings partly on the rediscovery of the prolific teachings and creeds of the medieval theologian Ibn Taymiyyah, which purported to give substance to the notion of a golden age. The influence of the Wahhabis was limited to the wilds of the Najd until their aggressiveness pushed them out of their deserts and into the Hijaz, the homeland of Makkah and Medina, and the fringes of Iraq. At that point, Ottoman authorities prevailed upon their then viceroy in Egypt, Muhammad Ali, to dispatch an expeditionary force into Arabia to destroy the Wahhabist state. The Wahhabis' capital, the village of Daria, was razed to the ground in 1818, and its ruler, Abdullah ibn Saud, was hauled off to Istanbul, where he was put to death. This apparently ended the Wahhabist revival. However, the themes associated with Wahhabism, especially its insistence that there was a pure Islam relating to the early days of the Prophet and his immediate successors, became the stock in trade of the next wave of religious reformers of the 19th and 20th centuries. Afghani, though a Shia by birth, and thus an apostate in the Wahhabi demonology, seemed to be the first to use the notion of a golden age whose values and conduct Muslims should return if they were to confront Western advances. This idea was later built on by Abduh, who resurrected the phrase as-Salaf as-Saleh, the righteous forefathers, to designate the idealized community of Islam. He included in it not only the companions of the Prophet and the early rightly guided caliphs, but also the carriers of the intellectual and religious legacy of Islam's middle period. This was an Islam where the rewards of scrupulous religious observance and obedience were political, intellectual, and worldly success. The Salafiyya movement or Salafism grew out of Abdu's reformist circles. It called for a return to the fundamentalist form of Islam before its perpetrated corruption by centuries of lax Muslim rulers and superstitious customs and innovations. It evolved further with the writings of Abdu's disciple Rashid Ridha, 1863 to 1935, and his widely read newspaper Al-Manar. From its base in Cairo, the paper reached the far corners of the Muslim world. The Salafiyya movement owes its origin to an intellectual reaction to the plight of the Muslims in the heyday of European ascendancy. It cannot seriously claim any continuity with the historical intellectual traditions of the Islamic civilization. In this sense, fundamentalist Islam is an eminently modern phenomena. Later in the 20th century, it converged with the Wahhabism, which was re-empowered after the fall of Arabian Peninsula to the forces of Ibn Saud in 1925. Both currents, Wahhabism and Salafism, joined forces to redefine the practices, beliefs, and norms of Islam for a great number of people. By the end of 19th century, the territorial, cultural, psychological unity of Islamic civilization had been torn apart. It was a unity based in the final analysis on the outcome of successive Muslim interaction with the Quran and with the prophetic message of in a geographical space which was continuous or that at least allowed for continuous contact. Islam did not participate in the epochal changes that transformed Western societies, and when modernity finally came to its societies, it was frequently accompanied by a sense of degradation and failure. The notion of the autonomous individual dedicated to progress and freedom, and the idea of the mass which interacts with the history as class or nation were utterly alien and too far removed from the legacy of Islam. Yet the elites of the Muslim world might have been able to connect with such notions if only because they had the material wherewithal and the political and social desire to do so. And some were open advocates of an eventual benign melding of Islam with the West. Sojourn in Paris and London, Afghani was smitten with the freedoms and order of the West. In Europe, I saw infidels who behaved as Muslims. In Muslim lands, I saw Muslims who behaved as infidels. He was reputed to have said this, but the individual Muslim could not easily jettison his or her worldview without a traumatic break with the past. How were they to acquire the virtues embodied in European civilization without seriously compromising or abandoning their own legacy? And what aspects of the West were they to acknowledge as the foundations of modernity? The Judeo Christian heritage, the literary traditions of France and England, parliamentary democracy, or the Prussian militarism, Renaissance art, or the culture and customs of the West, seeing in them the prototypes of all that was vital and progressive. Entirely new arenas of arts and cultures appeared to beacon from the novel writing and playwriting to painting and opera. But the ensuing hybrid culture would never amount to much. It was unable to establish its worth in the modern terms by using contemporary aesthetic or critical standards. Islam's own heritage of high culture was being removed as the living and guiding tradition for the moral and creative Muslim, and it was replaced sometimes by its own guardians by something entirely alien, the imported culture of the West. At the same time, the terms upon which modernity was introduced into Islamic society were very different in form and intent from what was taking place in the West itself. It often arrived and garbled and barely recognizable form, mimicking rather than duplicating the original model. The comparison with Japan is once again very instructive. Tokyo University reached the heights of academic excellence, but not so Syed Ahmad Khan's Aligarh Muslim University or the Egyptian University at Cairo, both of which were established along European lines and with the loftiest of intentions of bringing modern education to the elites. The disruption of continuity with the past was not something that the ordinary Occidental needed to ponder or manage, even when historical change advanced at a rapid pace. After all, the locus of the great engine of transformation was firmly the West. The Muslim individual, increasingly disconnected from his past and not yet in the folds of the atomized crowd, had nowhere to turn for what was familiar and comprehensible. The divisions within the Muslim societies became ever sharper as the 19th century came to a close. The work of Islam's modernizers was pushing religion increasingly into the private sphere where it could never belong exclusively in any case. By trying to come to terms with the European ascendancy, the reformers succeeded, perhaps unconsciously, in justifying an entirely different perspective on life. They used their own construct of Islam, one which was not contiguous with Islam's own past. They even purported to give it moral sanction. As the living edifice of the civilization was gradually being dismantled, Islam retreated into a historical consciousness which retained a still powerful sense of identity. It would emerge later in the 20th century in forms that would be scarcely distinguishable.